Welcome to the launch of the latest IISS Adelphi book, Weary Policeman, American Power in an Age of Austerity, written by my colleague Dana Allin of the IISS, who will talk to us today, and Eric Jones of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, who cannot be with us today. In addition to recording thanks to them for writing this study, I'd like to acknowledge the Institute's gratitude to those who first inspired us to undertake it, set some of the exam questions, and then provided the resources needed to supply a serious and careful set of answers. The late Mr. Disk Dean and his widow Carol Dean, and the Robert and Ardis James Foundation. Debates about American power and its uses and the form and extent of America's international role are inevitably as old as the Republic. In the lifespan of the United States since independence, we've seen almost every shade and variant, a process of oscillation towards and away from extremes punctuated at one end by the limited foreign policy of the immediate post-foundation period, which manipulated a set of European colonial rivalries in order to give the Republic room and time to grow, and at the other end, the American global strategic ubiquity of the Cold War period. And that oscillation has, of course, been driven by considerations about the threats to be warded off or the opportunities to be seized, and usually by the availability of resources to do either. The US appears now to be searching for a new kind of balance. The international system it largely established and largely maintained and policed has involved expenses as well as strategic dividends, and under its canopy, new power centers have emerged, not all of them necessarily sympathetic to the US. The shock of 9/11 had an aftermath entailing interventions longer than either of the two world wars, and which coincided with a dramatic financial and economic crisis which sharpened the strategic choices the US has to arbitrate. This book thinks its way through the dilemmas that are entailed in those choices, and of course what it all means for the rest of us. So with that, I'll hand over to Dana Allin to present the main conclusions. Thank you.
I'm going to do two things that are basically repeating what Adam just said, but I do need to preface things with an expression of my gratitude to my co-author, Eric Jones, who can't be here because he's under an eminently sensible family-imposed travel ban for the month of July. And I also want to add my own note of thanks to Carol Dean, to the late Disk Dean, and the Robert and Ardis James Foundation. As Adam said, their support was not just financial, but crucially intellectual in focusing our attention on this subject. And I don't know that by myself I would have picked so ambitious a project, but I'm really happy and grateful to have been nudged into doing so, because it's allowed me and my co-author to think hard about America's global role in an historical perspective. In that historical perspective, let me start with a somewhat extensive explanation of what we mean by the age of austerity, and why, for that matter, the American policeman appears to be weary. What we certainly do not mean is that the United States is insolvent under any common sense meaning of the term. On the contrary, if we had adequate economic growth, then simply returning to Clinton-era tax rates would cut something like $3.9 trillion off the national debt by 2020, which would bring our deficit down to about 2.5% of GDP. And so under reasonable economic conditions, that would mean that the debt was no longer growing faster than the economy. Meanwhile, the United States government can borrow vast sums of money at extremely low rates of interest. And it should be doing so vigorously to counteract the contraction of spending by state and local governments, the continuing deleveraging of the private sector economy. The various stimulus, the main stimulus package of President Obama's first year certainly helped in this regard, but it was too small. The mini stimulus that followed last year was certainly too small, but my point is that right now we need more federal spending rather than less. And I would just observe that defense spending is federal spending. It might have a lower multiplier effect, but it's not nothing. As Jonathan Chait rather mordantly observed, America got out of the Great Depression through the great Keynesian program of World War II. And if they had taken all those tanks and airplanes and dumped them into the ocean rather than deploying them to the battlefield, they would have had the same positive economic consequences without the horrific human consequences. In an historical perspective, I might add that Robert Kagan, whom I esteem as perhaps the most brilliant of the neoconservatives, was right to argue in a recent New Republic article, which was actually adapted from his latest book, that the middle of a savage economic crisis is precisely the wrong time to draw definite conclusions about the future of American global power. This was the article that President Obama referred to in a White House meeting a few hours before his last State of the Union address, where he, that is Obama, declared, "Anyone who tells you that America is in decline or that our influence has waned doesn't know what they're talking about." I think it's worth reading a few lines from the Kagan article, which we also quote in our book. Kagan writes, "One recession or even a severe economic crisis need not mean the beginning of the end of a great power. The United States suffered deep and prolonged economic crises in the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 1970s. In each case, it rebounded in the following decade and actually ended up in a stronger position relative to the other powers than before the crisis. The 1910s, the 1940s, and the 1980s were all high points of American global power and influence." Now, for a different kind of perspective, it's worth looking at the one slide of my presentation. This is from the IISS military balance. We've also reproduced it in our book. And it shows comparative defense expenditures in a form that look like those astronomy books that I loved so much as a child, where you could see that all the planets can fit inside Jupiter, and there's no, and furthermore, there's no Saturn. But you know, a key point to make about this chart is if you look at the next 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the next 9 powers, 4 of the next 9 are treaty allies of the United States. And a 5th is an American strategic partner. And of the remaining 4, only 2 could even remotely be considered hostile to American or Western values and interests. Now, there is, however, of course, the question of the long run, over the course of which some of us, or at least our children, are still going to be alive. And the long run does raise problems that aren't really covered by this chart or by Kagan's historical argument. The first problem is one of relative decline. 2 of Kagan's historical examples were taken from historical periods when America's relative share of world output was growing, while his third example was in the decade during which our superpower rival was in the process of imploding. Now, China, to take the most salient, or at least the most talked about example, looks likely to face all sorts of economic and political and demographic problems over the next 50 years. It is not currently signaling intentions to challenge the United States globally, and perhaps it never will. Nonetheless, the world that most of us want to see, or at least should want to see, is a world in which a country's share of global wealth converges on its share of global population. And sustaining U.S. strategic hegemony in that world is going to be more difficult. And I'm not arguing it's impossible, but it's certainly going to be more difficult. There are more acute problems. Kagan may be right to say we should not let the current crisis distort our historical perspective, but at the same time, we can't ignore the possibility that the exertions of maintaining U.S. strategic hegemony have been among the causes of the current crisis. Charles Kindleberger was one of the great theorists of the argument that the international system needs a global hegemon, but he also implied circumstances in which an inadequate or malign hegemony could be destabilizing rather than sustaining. My co-author and I were both doctoral students of David Kaleo, who's devoted much of his career to warning about the ill effects of American hegemony on both its own domestic political economy and the world political economy. And 3 years ago, at the IISS Global Strategic Review, Robert Skidelsky drew specifically on Kaleo's work to argue that the macro imbalances between Chinese oversaving and American overspending are what, and I'm quoting Skidelsky here, enabled the US government to live beyond its means by getting other countries to finance its imperial pretensions. And Skidelsky went on to argue about, again I'm quoting, the role of the US fiscal deficit in precipitating the financial meltdown. Now, there will always be a kind of chicken or egg argument about whether the problem has been American overspending or Chinese oversaving. That was sort of the prime problem and original culprit here. But even if you assume that Chinese savings had to be lent somewhere, you cannot pretend that America's huge defense budget, and its global strategic role has not required choices or priorities. And yet there has, in the political debate which I'm most familiar with, which is the American political debate, there has been that pretense. I'm going to read another quote, which I actually cited in some remarks that I delivered in this room, I think, last year. So some of you may have been in the room, and forgive me for repeating it, but I think it conveys a key psychological insight from Bill Emmett, the former economist editor who's currently an IISS trustee. And he was writing on the 10th anniversary of the 11 September attacks and arguing, I think this was in a piece in the Times, he was arguing that among the most devastating consequences of September 11th were the global economic crisis. Like Skidelsky, Emmett argued that the wars that bin Laden were the cause of the crash, both in the direct cost they incurred, but I think more importantly in the wider kind of mindset they inspired. And this was what he wrote about. He said, think of the psychology, he wrote. If Mr. Greenspan was so ideologically determined to keep his hands off the markets, why did he raise interest rates 6 times to burst the dot-com bubble in 1999? Why, after 2001, by contrast, did he keep pumping in credit to housing and banks, even as another bubble formed? Why did fiscal policy under the presidency of George W. Bush also turn expansionary, with spending soaring and taxes cut? And he gives the example of the UK under Blair and Brown as well. The answer is simple. There was a war on, or rather 2 wars, not even counting the vague one on terror. At such times, the inclination to risk an economic global slowdown or a new recession diminishes. After 9/11, President Bush said Americans should do the patriotic thing and go out spending again. Now, I can't say whether Emmett was right here about everyone's specific and precise motivations. But as we argue in the book, he was clearly onto an important insight regarding the psychology of the American political class in relation to America's world role. American elites have been chronically reluctant to concede that the role of world policemen requires an explicit trade-off against Americans' living standards. The Johnson administration was not willing to propose that kind of a trade-off for the Vietnam War. The George W. Bush administration was not willing to do so regarding Iraq or Afghanistan. And the problem here is not confined to wars that are controversial or, in my view, unwise and unnecessary. On the contrary, the 1991 war to reverse Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was both justified and necessary. And it's easy to imagine future necessary wars that are required by America's global security role. A good example, an excellent example, is Korea, because it was the battleground of America's first post-World War II police action, so to speak. And I think it's key to think about the shift that took place in America's posture and psychology between the Second World War and the Korean War. The Second World War was considered an existential contest for which it was natural to expect Americans to mobilize every sinew of state, society, and economy. It was an emergency, however, lasting for the United States less than 4 years. By contrast, a permanent war footing, and I think that chart can't be described as anything else, for the permanent position of world's policeman is either going to require an endless source of deficit financing, which is not impossible, or a more fundamental rethink about the purposes of the American state and society. Now, of course, the financial and economic consequences of America's post-9/11 wars were not the only or even remotely the worst costs of those wars. But as I said earlier, I think it's economic costs that, for reasons I could get into, are most easily elided over in the American political debate. And that's why President Obama's June 2009 West Point speech was so significant, where he said, "I refuse to set goals that go beyond our responsibility, our means, or our interests. And I must weigh all of the challenges that our nation faces. I don't have the luxury of committing to just one. Indeed, I'm mindful of the words of President Eisenhower, who, in discussing our national security, said each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs." So the promise here at the end of Obama's first year in office was to restore a kind of small c conservatism to American strategic policy. And the question that immediately arises and that we grapple with in our book is this really possible? Now, I hope you won't be discouraged from reading the book if I confess to you that we don't really give a definitive answer to that question. What we do instead is to lay out a framework of 3 schools or 3 options for U.S. foreign policy. These are ideal types. I mean, it's important to understand that they bleed into each other and across party and across ideology. No individual, or at least almost no individual, fits into a single school consistently. But it's worth setting them out, I think, to understand American options and also the nature of the American debate. The most rigorously conservative category is what we call pluralist. According to this view, the natural and inevitable distribution of power in the world is a plural distribution. American hegemony over that world is unnatural, unsustainable, and corrosive to both American domestic political economy and to the international system. Imperial pretensions are dangerous, and even if the exceptionalist genius of Americans is in a certain sense acknowledged, that's not seen to diminish the danger. And the pluralists, people who belong to this school, have included George Kennan, Charles de Gaulle, Paul Kennedy. As I mentioned earlier, Kaleo and Skidelsky in various ways have belonged to this school. Pluralists are highly attentive to economic power, and they may have a greater tendency to discount military power. Hence the fact that the European Union has long been an economic peer of the United States is something that David Kaleo finds more significant than does Robert Kagan. The rigorous category on the other side is what we call idealism. This includes neoconservatives and liberal internationalists. It includes Robert Kagan and Madeleine Albright. I came to this institute 15 years ago propounding idealist arguments regarding the Balkans, and I certainly wouldn't repudiate them now, even if I think that American idealism has gotten us into some trouble subsequently. But in the language of our Adelphi, however you pronounce it, idealism propounds a world that needs a policeman who can be counted on more often than not to know right from wrong and to act accordingly. The policeman will not be an angel. Robert Kagan spends much of his excellent book, Dangerous Nation, conceding as much. But a policeman in this view is indispensable, and there is no other country beside the United States that combines the wealth, the power, and the historical vocation to take on this role. There's a middle school or option, which is what we call realist. Now, realism in our meaning is not really to be confused with the school of international relations theory that goes by the same name. Realism is more of a foreign policy attitude or proclivity. It is mindful of American limits, of the dangers of overextension and the problem of unintended consequences. At the philosophical top of this game, realists are trying to figure out how to use the flow of history to America's advantage. Nixon and Kissinger have to be credited as accomplished American realists in this sense, the opening to China being their great realist achievement. And Barack Obama fits this category, not perfectly, but in significant ways. And when he ran for president, he expressed admiration for the foreign policy realism, and realism in the terms I'm speaking of the first, that is the senior Bush administration, as exemplified by Brent Scowcroft, James Baker, and although I think he was still in uniform at the time, Colin Powell. Now, in much political analysis, there's a kind of lazy inclination to assume that the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. So maybe I should be embarrassed to say that we come down to endorsing, perhaps half-heartedly, this middle option. We don't come from a position of pure objectivity. We were both supporters of the Obama candidacy when he was running for president, but I do think even with a degree of intellectual honesty, it's fair to say that there's considerable evidence that Obama foreign policy, at least, has been fairly successful. David Remnick in The New Yorker had a nice column in which he compared Obama's foreign policy to John F. Kennedy's foreign policy based on the first principle of doing no harm, and really paying a lot of attention to the realization or the fundamental fact that the biggest thing you can do in foreign policy is make big mistakes. And that's the first thing you want to try to avoid. In theoretical terms, moreover, I think what the administration has been trying to do has made a lot of sense. It affirmed its deadline for withdrawal of combat troops from Afghanistan. It withdrew from Iraq. It has announced plans for a substantial, not huge, but substantial reductions in U.S. infantry forces. As you know, in January, the Pentagon released a new strategy guidance that set out the concept for a strategic pivot or a rebalancing of U.S. forces toward Asia-Pacific. Meanwhile, I think the administration's reliance on drones for the purpose of what has to fairly be called targeted assassination, although no doubt morally, perhaps even legally problematic, it does really underscore a kind of more narrow but still vigorous assertion of core American national security interests. And as a number of commentators have pointed out, it's somewhat fashionable now to talk about the name for what this strategy is that the Obama administration is pursuing. It's an old name called Offshore Balancing. It's, as Peter Beinart has written, it's the idea that America can best contain our adversaries not by confronting them on land, but by maintaining our naval and air power and strengthening those smaller nations that see us as a natural counterweight to their larger neighbors. Now, I would argue that this is a real strategy and a real doctrine. What I cannot say with absolute confidence is that it's perfectly sustainable. I can't say confidently that offshore balancing won't slide into future onshore wars that we would have been better off avoiding. This is fundamentally because the Obama national security policy can only be considered a radical retrenchment in comparison to the post-9/11 wars of the Bush administration. In terms of broader American commitments, there has not been any real serious retrenchment. Indeed, with a speech that Obama gave to AIPAC this spring and an interview with the Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg a few days before, the United States is now more or less officially committed to preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Our pivot to East Asia is meant to rely on rejuvenated allies and avoiding conflict, but of course something bad could happen in the Taiwan Strait or on the Korean Peninsula. Moreover, and I think this really cannot be understated, it's something I think would be worth discussing at some length in Q&A. There has been, I mentioned the kinds of Balkans issues that I was engaged in 15 years ago. And there has been a moral ratcheting up of U.S. humanitarian commitments. This has been a long process, and it needs to be taken seriously. Read Obama's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech to see how seriously he takes it. Consider the U.S. intervention in Libya. Not the stuff about leading from behind, something else we should discuss, but the fact that the United States faced a choice, had a major policy debate within the administration, and it chose to intervene. And without endorsing it or actually seeing how it would make a lot of strategic sense, I would not be shocked to see a U.S. intervention in Syria in the coming 12 months. Now, perhaps a more intellectually rigorous conclusion of our book would have been to a kind of wholesale acceptance of the consequences of a more plural world. To say that what happens in Syria is really none of our business, and moreover, and this was in a sense the most radical form of pluralism, accepting that we really can't prevent countries from developing nuclear weapons if they see it in their interest. And I think that is a reality that does convey something about the realities of the more plural world we face. But it's not one that American traditions or sense of mission can so readily bend to. I hope you don't consider it a cop-out if I say this is really just an empirical observation, although it is also true that I take some pride in American traditions and even the American sense of mission, if it's properly tempered by realism. There are two, I'm going to finish here. There are two major themes of the book that, due to lack of time, I really haven't been able to speak about, but I did want to flag them. The first is a somewhat lengthy discussion of American political paralysis. And you know, we argue essentially that America's acute period of what I would call political decline and paralysis is really a more salient threat than long-term relative decline, which is something the United States can probably adjust to. The second, in a way, a second parallel theme of our book, which we do spend a long time discussing, is how to put it, is essentially the future of the West. And by the West, I mean specifically the transatlantic community. As I said before, the Obama administration has propounded a doctrine that imagines a more limited and narrow definition and defense of American interests, but at the same time takes a fairly robust view of what an international community should be able to accomplish, particularly in moral terms and on such issues as the responsibility to protect. Now, the only way to square this circle of a more narrowly defined U.S. strategy and a rather expansive view of what the international community should do, bearing in mind the international community is a problematic word, is to rely on allies. That reliance was at the heart of the Libyan intervention. It was successful in just about any term I can think of, but it's probably not a perfect template for the future. And in any event, it doesn't seem compatible right now with the prospective breakdown of the euro and conceivably the breakup of the European Union. And here again, the problem is, in my view, political. It involves bad political choices and bad political and economic ideas. Although you might say you might rephrase that as unfortunate political realities. But I'll end here and look forward to your reactions and questions.
Thanks very much, Dana. We have about half an hour or so for discussions and comments and questions and so on. And maybe I could just lead off by inviting you to elaborate a little bit more on the question of political paralysis that you touched on. I think it was interesting in your remarks that you cautioned us against an overly economically determinist approach to these issues, that America's attitude and its actions are not simply going to be driven by questions of resources, but questions about self-image, moral imperative, and this thing that you refer to as a sense of mission. And in any case, earlier on in your argument, you were essentially positing the view that America's war readiness is economically sustainable in view of the availability, as you put it, of financing through debt issuance and some other things. So turning then to this issue of the political paralysis, I mean, can you put that into some sort of context for us? How exceptional is the political paralysis that you see? How permanent is it? Or is this simply a form of indulgence that the American body politic can allow itself in a period in which the emergencies it faces are not existential, in the same way that one could say that some of the economic problems it has faced have also been perhaps driven by a sense of indulgence and occupying an exceptional position that does not require tough choices to be made. So just fill in that sort of latent blank for us a bit more on the political side.
Well, I think it is exceptional. I wouldn't say that is the state of American political polarization and paralysis, really. I wouldn't say it's unique. I mean, after all, we fought a civil war when we couldn't reach agreement, but that was quite a while ago. And why has it come about? Why is it exceptional? It's well, lots of people spend lots of time trying to think about this. It's very difficult since it involves a zero-sum confrontation between two political parties without commenting on which party seems to be more at fault. But let me try to put it in somewhat more structural and constitutional terms. The United States has an 18th century constitution that is based on a division, a separation of powers that has only really been able to function when there's been a degree of cross-party consensus about the basic purposes of American state and society. Now, this cross-party consensus functioned in weird ways. I mean, it's been observed by a number of political analysts that, ironically and weirdly, things worked better in the United States during the era of racial segregation, because you had which was a big deal in the country that I grew up in. And it worked because the Democratic Party was a kind of ramshackle coalition that included very conservative Southern segregationists, Northeastern and Midwestern liberals, and there were a lot of battles that were fought out within the party. But on the other side, you had a Republican Party that was also heterogeneous, included Northeastern liberals and Southwestern conservatives. In a certain sense, the end of segregation sorted these parties out. That was part of what happened. And the Democrats became much more, I wouldn't say they became much more liberal, because in their policies they weren't so much more liberal, but much more homogenous. The Republicans, I think it is fair to say, in the last 20 years have become much more conservative. And the difference I'm making here is important, because somebody in this room can possibly describe to me one policy of the Obama administration that is to the left of the policies of Richard Nixon. I bet they would have a hard time coming up with it. It's really the shift to the right of the Republican Party that has been most significant. And we've really reached a point of near breakdown in terms of the purposes of the American state, American society, and arguments, and these have been played out in these budget debacles, including last summer's, was it last summer? Yeah, last summer's really egregious example of the impasse over raising the debt ceiling. And if you look at, I was just looking at a Gallup poll about national, if I had had time, I would have tried to reproduce it here, but national business confidence, or economic confidence. It wasn't business confidence, but economic confidence. And of course, what you saw was a huge drop at the time of the financial collapse in 2008, a steady increase. And then at the time of the debt ceiling argument in last summer, economic confidence fell almost to where it was in the depth of the immediately after the financial collapse. This was a completely unnecessary, self-inflicted own goal. The problem is that it is in the logic of the American constitutional system. And now you're hearing the Democratic Party, I can make an argument about why what the Democratic Party is proposing is less reckless than what the Republican Party is proposing, but nonetheless, they want to use the next one to also enforce a kind of leverage. The next one is the fact that on December 31st of this year, owing to the inability to reach a budget agreement, the last time, basically, and I forget the exact sums, but $100 billion a year are automatically cut from defense and from US domestic spending at the same time that there's an immediate reversion to Clinton-era tax rates. And I spoke positively of a reversion to Clinton-era tax rates, but if both of these things happened at the same time, there would be a near guarantee that the United States would go back into recession. Sorry, that was a rambling response.
Not at all. Okay. David Buchan.
Thanks a lot. A fascinating talk, Dana. Just on polarizing figures, I think FDR was a very polarizing figure in the 30s, but of course he was the existential emergency of the Second World War unified the nation behind him. You make the very interesting point about the elite's unwillingness to accept a trade-off between military spending or the world role and any decline in US living standards, I guess reflected in or influenced by federal spending. I just wondered, that's clearly true, but inside the federal budget, there have been trade-offs, and the big purple blob there of the defense budget has benefited, has to some extent been traded off against cuts in domestic programs over the years. My question is, you mentioned if they come to pass and there is a big cut in defense spending, what would you, and let's say we get a President Romney, what would you, is this going to hamstring his what you would guess would be his foreign policy, his foreign policy?
Look, this automatic sequestering is something that the Defense Secretary Leon Panetta says would be, I don't know if he's used this word, but has said would be catastrophic. Now, what he means by that is it would be very, very hard to, they're not planning for it, and it would mess up their plans. It would not paralyze U.S. power. I mean, we're still talking about a huge defense budget. And I assume that a President Romney, with a Republican Congress would be able to restore much of defense spending. And of course, Romney has spoken about a floor of 4% for U.S. defense spending, as 4% of GDP. And the immediate consequences, the immediate economic consequences I talked about would be very dire, and that would have sending the United States back into recession would not provide a very strong basis for going forward in terms of anything, including defense posture. But in terms of future budgeting, of course, we're not going to march lemming-like off a cliff forever. I mean, I think the broader point I would make is this, though, because I'm glad you raised this issue. in my remarks, I may have sounded a bit, and I didn't mean to, but I was looking at what I considered the main emergency right now and the main priority, which is to get the economy going again. And as I said, there are ways to see the defense, the U.S. deficit being cut, very significantly with modest tax increases. This is not to deny that over the long term, the United States does face a serious problem, and that problem derives mainly from the growing healthcare costs for the elderly. And the future American budget balance is going to require, it seems to me, some combination of higher taxes, restrained healthcare costs, and cuts and restraint in defense spending. Now, I'm not really a budget expert, but I mean, it's pretty clear that you can make an argument purely based on numbers that you can do it without cutting defense spending. In practical terms, that would mean, particularly given the resistance of very powerful elderly constituents to changes in Social Security and particularly Medicare spending. In practice, that would require gutting almost everything else that the federal government does, which is, I mean, people come up with these lists, and it's pretty horrific, and I don't think it's really going to happen. In practical terms, or in political terms, I think it obviously has to be some combination of defense, I just said this, defense spending, tax increases, restraint of health care costs. We have an experience of the United States having fairly recently had a very achieved budget surplus. And that involved a substantial peace dividend. Right now, American defense spending is equivalent to the peak years of the Reagan administration. Now, of course, the problem for the world's policeman is there's no proper benchmark for what the United States needs to spend on defense, because if you're in charge of the world, any contingency is possible, and I'm not trying to make light of this. I mean, we have a lot of commitments. But it does seem to be somewhat incredible that the United States has to spend the same amount on defense as it did when we faced the Soviet Union. Central Europe was an armed garrison, et cetera.
Mark Fitzpatrick, please.
Thank you, Dana. And first, I apologize if it looked like I was playing with my iPhone. I was tweeting. You used the term American exceptionalism, a term one hears a lot these days as part of a debate about whether Obama believes in it or not. Do you think that the rise in the emphasis on this concept has a causal relationship with the relative decline of American power, ironic as though that may be, or is it just part of this rightward shift in the American polity that you referred to?
I'm choosing my words carefully here because not out of an excess of caution, but because I honestly don't really know the answer. I mean, there is a palpable anxiety about, you could say it's about America's place in the world, but I mean, declinism is generally perceived, I think, as economic decline, as threats to American prosperity. And this has been combined with, I think, a sense among white working class and perhaps more elderly Americans that America is changing radically in a way that is quite bewildering. And to a certain extent, President Obama is a pretty strong emblem of that change. I'm not for a moment, saying that the anxieties, I mean, there is obviously a tinge of racism in some of the Tea Party reaction, but the general reaction, I think, is more a sort of inchoate anxiety. And so, I mean, I'm treading around the edges of the fact that I do think this fuels some of the claims that Obama doesn't believe in America's mission or is constantly apologizing, which seems to me just empirically false. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that this is why Mitt Romney has talked about this so much. I think, frankly, he's talked about this so much because Obama foreign policy does not present otherwise a very strong, very broad target. It's perceived by most Americans as being fairly successful. You know, the broader question about American exceptionalism is an interesting one to discuss in a non-American audience. You know, it is this sense of mission or license that America has, that America feels it has. It goes very deep. It's not an exclusively right-wing idea. Far from it. I think it's something that Obama actually certainly believes in, and certainly someone like Madeleine Albright spoke in these terms. It has a religious component, and you know, I think you can define a secular version of it and a religious version of it. But the fervor of it does have religious roots. We spend a lot of time in the book, and I even did in my remarks, talking about the writings and the ideas of Bob Kagan, because in a certain sense, you know, that book of his, the famous book of his, Power and Weakness, or that was the name of the article, was trying to convey a structural and empirical basis for American exceptionalism, a secular version of American exceptionalism, and I don't think it's very far from what Obama himself believes.
Thanks.
It's not easy to, as I say, it's not self-evident perhaps to a non-American audience. On the other hand, America's role in the world, I mean, there are plenty of people here who may want to argue with me about this, but in historical terms, I think America's role in the world has been relatively congenial to the rest of the world. Was that too parsed?
Mr. Tain here in front.
Thank you, Adam. I'm Tain, Asia and Pacific Affairs. Adam, in your opening remark, you did touch on Taiwan and Korean Peninsula, and we know that U.S. is reallocating 60% of the naval forces in Asia Pacific. Sometimes we can get the signals confused. Way back 1950 January, Dean Acheson's statement in New York Press Club, he almost excluded the Korean Peninsula from the U.S. strategic interests, and therefore, when the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, U.S. massive response took Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai a bit surprised. I just want to know, as far as Asia Pacific concerned, if you can throw a bit of light, U.S. standing on South China Sea and Sea of Japan should something go untoward. I wonder if you could have
the last part of that, U.S. standing on South China Sea.
and Sea of Japan should something go wrong. East China Sea. Sorry to be Regent.
Is that a relatively congenial question?
I might ask Adam to answer that question. You know, I think that the U.S. strategy is based on an effort to restore the confidence of allies and partners in the region, that they're not going to be abandoned in the face of Chinese encroachments or intimidation, but to do so without provoking a view on the part of China that the U.S. is interested in an aggressive form of containment against China's rise. So, I mean, that's a rather vague answer, but I think it's about as I think it conveys what the U.S. is about, and what the specific contingency would be if, I don't know, if the United States was. You're asking presumably if the United States would be prepared to go to war.
Not necessarily. How firm will you? Because right now China has pushed the envelope a bit, and especially in South China Sea, they have set up a few of the islands.
Yeah.
Military forces, whatever, they have declared a particular city or whatever they want to call it. It's that they're really pushing for a bit of a confrontation, for example, with Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, whatever. I mean, these guys are fairly close to the United States. There will come a time, U.S. may be at least make a firm response. You know what I'm trying to say. Where do we go from here? So
Well, I think
China's pushing there.
yeah, I think the United States, the administration believes that it has already succeeded in restoring the confidence of countries that might have felt intimidated by Chinese moves and behavior and statements. Whether that's the case or not, I don't really know.
Desmond Bowen.
Yes.
Thanks very much. I'd just like to go back to your point about exceptionalism, and you referred, and I thought very interestingly, to the sort of development of the sort of US psychology. Of course, there's a question of whether that's the political leadership or the people at large, and the sense of purpose. But I mean, in all of that, I mean, is there a sense that there is a shift to vital interests as being the motivating factor rather than moral leadership and moral issues? And it does seem to me that that's a sort of, maybe it's a rather puerile dividing line, but I mean, do you see a shift in, as it were, the value that's attached to one rather than the other?
Yes, I do see a shift. I mean, but the problem is, I mean, first of all, it's very much focused on, specific to the Obama administration. It's certainly not contained in the campaign rhetoric, or as far as I can see, the actual views of Governor Romney. It's what I described as a more narrow but still vigorous defense of U.S. security interests, and a rather devastating campaign of targeted assassinations against al-Qaeda figures is one example of that. But I'm just repeating myself here, but it sits uneasily, or it's in tension with other things the Obama administration has been doing. One is deciding to draw a line in the sand, or a red line regarding Iran's building nuclear weapons. Now, you can look at that statement in two different ways. The one way is to say, we've actually stepped back from insisting that we will do anything to prevent Iran from developing a latent nuclear capability. On the other hand, the administration has more or less ruled out a policy of deterrence and containment against a hypothetical Iran armed with nuclear weapons, and I think that's a fairly significant move. Whether that the administration, I've spoken to people in the administration who say, yes, we do believe that it is actually a vital interest of the United States, a vital national security interest, that Iran not develop nuclear weapons. It's also obviously seen as an even more vital national security interest of Israel, and the relationship between the truly special relationship in the world is the one between the United States and Israel. So, it's very difficult to disentangle these two things. I think again, this is repeating what I said in my remarks, but I think the ratcheting up, the slow and progressive ratcheting up of American views of humanitarian responsibilities is something that cannot be underestimated. And of course, it flies completely in the face of the kind of realist retrenchment that I'm arguing about, that I'm suggesting the Obama administration is about. But at the same time, he didn't invent it, but he reaffirmed an international responsibility to protect that is going to logically have to usually very often involve U.S. military power. These things are in tension with one another, and I can't reconcile them. They just have to continue to exist until one gains the upper hand.
Lady Kennett, please.
I imagine you saw the President's article a couple of days ago.
I'm sorry, whose article?
I imagine you saw the President's article a couple of days ago about cyber vulnerability. I don't know if you deal with that in the end of your book, which I haven't yet got to. I found it fascinating up to now.
Okay.
But cyber vulnerability does seem to change the balance of power globally. As he points out, small countries can indeed engage in cyber attack. And the other point is the tendency of the United States to demonization. There's quite a lot of demonization of China going on, and that is, of course, advantageous for what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Demons need arming against.
Well, I don't know that I'd agree that cyber vulnerability changes the balance of power, but it certainly opens up new avenues of asymmetric attack against the balance, against American power. We talk in the context of Iran about the Stuxnet virus, and we went to press before more recent revelations. We don't really discuss cyber issues any further, but I would add that the IISS, under the capable hand of Nigel Inkster, has a very, very important program looking into cyber issues. Lady Kennett, I don't agree that the United States demonizes China. I do agree that there is a tendency to say harsh things about China every 4 years. And, but it's one of the iron laws of American foreign policy politics that the challenger attacks the incumbent for being soft on China and then reverts to the incumbent's China policy when it comes to office. I can't actually recall what Barack Obama said about China, but I certainly recall Bill Clinton attacking, these weren't the exact words, but essentially coddling the first Bush administration as coddlers of the butchers of Tiananmen. But I think that every American presidency finds itself locked into an unavoidable relationship with China that is partly competition and partly partnership. There are two factors that make this will continue to make this relationship difficult, and maybe more difficult in the future. The first is fears about what happens as China rises, but there is no sign now that China has any ambition to really replace the United States or challenge America's position in the world. And if it did decide to do so, there would be plenty of strategic warning. So I think treating this as, you can worry about it in a way that is self-fulfilling. The second issue is human rights, and I have a very good friend who is one of my contributing editors in Survival, Professor Lan Xinjiang, who accuses America of being on a kind of who's not uncritical of Chinese domestic practices, but nonetheless accuses the United States of being on a kind of long-term crusade aimed at ultimate regime change in China. And I can only say to him that in a sense this is the human rights concerns of the United States will not go away. They may be hypocritical in many regards, they're certainly inconsistent, but they won't go away. And they're going to continue to be, I would say, more than an irritant, a significant factor in U.S.-Chinese relations. But that's not the same thing as demonizing China. I think there's actually great care is taken not to demonize China and to use language that is both respectful of and, how shall I put it,
I was thinking of the Republican presidential candidates, all of whom seem to...
Yes, but that's what I was referring to earlier. It's the iron law of American politics that you engage in this process when you're running for president. And it's not confined to the Republicans. It's the Democrats have done it as well.
Thanks. Gentleman in the back row there.
I want to take up again the issue of American exceptionalism. I grew up in America, went through American schools, so I was taught about American exceptionalism. It seems to traditionally, and in a sense almost when I was a child, American exceptionalism was at variance with the idea of America's global policeman. Involved
I'm sorry, at variance with the idea of
America
yeah.
as a global anything.
Yeah.
It involved America being separate from the world. I mean, during the argument about America, whether America should get involved in World War II, it was about whether American purity would be sullied by getting involved with the sordid power struggles of those old countries of Europe. This was caricature, of course, but this was very much the sense of it. After the war, when America became global policeman, then yes, America was exceptional because once again, Americans felt that their motivations were morally superior to those of other countries. They were not just one country among many in the power struggle. Don't you think that the role of American policemen is inseparable in American eyes from the idea of the American exceptionalism? And once this idea is waning, purely partly in terms of power, then in terms of power, America is becoming obviously less exceptional. It's becoming one country among many, that this acceptance of the role of global policeman will also wane.
Well, I mean, there was a lot packed into that comment, which I think most of which I agree with. It is certainly the case that American exceptionalism has historical roots in American separation. And there was, at the time, both before and immediately after World War II, there were, fervent American exceptionalists such as Robert Taft, who believed that the United States was going to be ruined by taking on this role and become precisely just one country among many and behave like, European great powers in the past. To a certain extent, someone like George Kennan had the same view, although he wasn't an isolationist. He certainly was someone who believed that he saw as a kind of overextended American imperial role would be bad for the world and bad for the United States. That definition of exceptionalism was just about completely supplanted, as I think you just said, by the Cold War, post-World War II version, which was a quasi-imperial definition. I don't really have any comment about your last prediction. I mean, it's certainly possible, but it's not happening anytime soon. It's not happening in the framework. There will be no. There was one presidential candidate who was amusing. I don't mean that in a dismissive terms, but Ron Paul expressed this view. And strangely enough, or maybe surprisingly to some people, he got a lot of support in the Republican Party. By a lot, I mean nothing like hegemonic support, but he got, and he's going to have, I think, a sizable contingent at the Republican National Convention. So you could say that the mini flourishing of Paulism And it came at a time when I do recall that people like Mitt Romney were saying, for a brief time, that the Afghans have to fight their own wars to stay of freedom, and so forth. There did seem to be a moment when something that kind of resembled traditional interwar isolationism was heard in the American presidential campaign. But I never took it particularly seriously. I think it was partly driven by the fact that they were challenging, they were representing the opposing party. And I think you see, now that Romney has won the nomination, the party is reverting to form, which is not to question the U.S. global role, and essentially the Democrats don't question the U.S. global role either.
Well, thank you very much, Dana. I think the questions thrown up in the discussion period, and indeed in the comments that you made to begin with, have demonstrated that this is a subject that touches on questions, yes, of military power and economics and politics, but also on moral philosophy, and all of it has global implications, and I think that in turn underlines the audacity, if I can put it that way, of taking on this project to begin with, for which I think we're very grateful, especially since you've done it with Eric so well. So thank you very much for that. Please join me in a round of applause for Dana.